Hey folks, today I'm going to show 22 read between 22 and the rest of you fine folks on how to make a miniature base that looks like it has a portal that goes to
space!
I made these bases for my Terra crew in Malifaux to match their theme, but you can use this for any miniature game you want because, well, I mean, come on, it's so cool. I used some cork, plastic cards, terrain bits, and airbrush in the spirit of Neil Armstrong, but you can use your own unique materials and techniques as a substitute. So recall your favorite lines from Armageddon. It's the size of Texas, Mr. President. And let's get this rocket launched. So we're gonna start off with a base. Hey, what's with the attitude? It's not as simple as that. See, some bases are made with textures on them, likely to help glue stuff to the surface, but we want to make sure to get a base with a nice flat face, as we'll want a good canvas for the space painting. Then we're going to take some cork, I think I got this from an old fortune teller, and rip off a piece or two to the shape that you want that roughly fits the top of the base. I take note of the side in which I rip the cork off. You may notice that the way you rip it off will make one side taper in the opposite direction. This will be important to keep in mind because we'll want to use the side that is larger as the bottom, or at least I prefer that side because it looks more natural as a crumbling earth. The other side's fine, but when we paint it later it won't show the texture of the cork from above quite as well. I'm planning on making the portal's space look like it opened in front of the model, so I keep it to a crescent shape for the opening, and I also rip off some of the overhanging sides on the back. I keep ripping off some more pieces from the top of the front side to further shape the slope I want. And once we have our pieces where we like, we'll use some super glue to keep the cork in place permanently. Try to make sure that the front part that meets the base is glued down really well. It'll be important later. Once the main piece of cork is set in place, I decide that I want to further emphasize the crescent shape, so I look through some spare bits of cork to find one that fits what I'm looking for. Once that's found, I glue it down. Because this is lower than the surrounding cork, it'll fit in really well when it's painted. Then I do the same thing to the other side. Now I'm going to add a bit more flavor to the base by taking some terrain bits I have lying around. In this case, it's a sort of column. I want to put something in the middle of the pool that would give the impression that this portal is just swallowing something down into the abyss below. Next up, we're going to make some paver stones to place on top of the cork. For this, we're going to take some plastic card, cut out some strips, and then cut those into rectangles and squares, and get enough cut in random sizes to fill in the top of the cork. When working with plastic card, you'll want to score 2 to 3 cuts before bending and popping out the cutting. Now this gets tedious, so when I get tired, I just like to use some editing magic. Spielberg, you have my number. Call me. Once we get plenty of those squares, we're going to cut off the corners of each square at about a 45-degree angle, or 50 degrees if you're nasty. I like to do this step so I get more of a rounded shape to the paver stones. Yet again, another tedious step in my process. Man, I really love torturing myself. Next, I'm gonna have to bevel the edges by using a hobby knife. Now, you're gonna have to think independently here, as I don't think my method is the safest way of approaching this. See, I actually keep a hobby knife with a super dull blade on it that I specifically use for stuff like this. While my sharp blade is used to cut the square and corners off, I use this dull blade to control how my shaping is done by scooping the blade toward my thumb. I can't figure out a better way to do this, as when I use a blade to cut away, it feels like I can't control the angles and movement and it just shears off an even bevel. But when I bring it toward me, I can change the angle while carving and get a more suitable edge. I'm open to any suggestions of doing this safer that you may have, as the Boy Scout hall monitor in me is screaming about OSHA procedures and tetanus. Make sure you're safe out there, folks, because I don't know what I'm doing. When I'm carving the edges like this, I first focus on getting a cool texture at the perimeter, and with each new shaving, I'm changing the angle and how deep I'm cutting into the stone. Sometimes I'll go really far into the center to get a random sharp triangle cut. Then later I may come from the bottom to carve out a big chunk to break up the straight lines that the stone begins with. Experiment to see what you like. And the torture continues until you've carved all of your stones to your liking. Don't worry, it gets pretty fun after this. Try not to question why you do this hobby for relaxation. With your phalanges intact, we'll move on to the next step by placing these stones on top of the cork in random patterns. I like to start with one big stone where I'd likely place a model's foot for some options in placement, then start radiating stones to surround this bad boy, avoiding a checkered look while also finding the right stones to fit the shape of the cork. The cool thing about using plasticard for this is that you can make the material suit whatever your heart desires, something that can get lost when you get a package of, say, pre-made hobby papers, but nothing's stopping you from using whatever you want to fit your theme. I defaulted to plasticard for the flatness that I can capitalize on when gluing the model on top, but whatever you use is not really a big deal. An example of this material's versatility can be seen here, where I see that I only have a tiny space to fill, so I cut one paver in half to fit and place the other half to look like it's sinking into the space hole. Yes, ladies, I make my own bricks. Please, make a single file line. To finish up this space, I added an additional column bit to tie it in with the one I placed earlier and add some elevation. While making the other bases, I decided to show another way to make your own little terrain bits if you don't have any lying around. I take some spare sprues that I'm sure we all have and usually just throw away, but these are great to keep around for some cool bricks. After cutting out a section, I used the same methodology we used for the paver stones, first cutting off corners for a rounded look, then beveling the edges, and finally carving out some random notches. I added these to give more varied elevations and sinkhole elements. And now we're ready to slap on some paint. I start with a black primer and make sure to get a solid coat in all the nooks and crannies of the cork, which likes to hide a lot of holes and stuff, so keep an eye out and hit it from several angles. Then I spray in some airbrush thinner and Vallejo Game Colors Cold Gray, keeping it exactly at a 48.5 degree angle, so that the black primer shows in the shadows. I want the majority of the materials to be gray, and if you don't have an airbrush, don't worry. You can just paint this as you normally would. Just try to keep some of the black in the shadows and maybe use less gray in the space hole area. Painting all these materials the same color really helps unify all the different textures and gives the impression that they're all similar stones and stuff. Then, without cleaning out the airbrush well, I add in some white ink. This is so that I don't have a pure white sprayed through, and with ink being a bit more translucent than acrylic, it helps to not make such a stark highlight. I start by radiating some spots in the center of the stones to trick the eye into seeing some depth at the edges. The main idea of this step is to highlight the top of the base so that it stands out in contrast to the lower areas near the pool, which you'll want to avoid painting with this color. I also make sure to hit the top parts of the column. Next, you'll want to take some pure white, a 20-year-old palette, and start dry brushing the edges of the stone and the cork. This is the step where you'll see all the hard work you put into carving each stone come to life. This is also one of the reasons why I didn't highlight earlier with pure white, as this will help the dry brushing really stand out. I keep the dry brushing fairly targeted and light, focusing on the edges of each stone and the parts of the cork that are further away from the portal edge. I also make sure to hit each corner of the pillars so that it has a stark highlight that defines the shape. Now we're going to prep the portal perimeter by airbrushing in some thinned white ink where the rim is going to be. Focus on making like a blinding light, even reaching into the crevices, but also being careful about not expanding the zone too much. We want this to be small, stark, and concentrated with an immediate short fade, like a military haircut. A good tip is to aim toward the pool to begin with, then start moving toward the rim where the cork meets the base to control the sprayed area. The purpose of this is to lighten the rubble for our next step. Which is now the current step. Funny how time works. Here we're going to take Badger's Minotaur line of ghost tints, specifically magenta. This is basically like an airbrushed glaze paint, which allows the underlying layer to be seen underneath like a candy coat. And the more you spray, the stronger the color gets. This paint can be finicky, but I absolutely love it. You just gotta get a feel for it and figure out the best ways to work with it. For me, it works best with a drop or two of airbrush thinner mixed in, even though it's already pretty thin and is ready to go from the bottle. However, I'm pretty sure that I put way too much thinner and spraying was a challenge, but once I got a few practice sprays in, I adjusted my approach to short bursts. It's actually not too big a deal if I get this messed up. We're really only going for adding color to the surrounding area from the portal, so precision isn't the main idea. Any extra overspray can help lend to the lighting effect. I slowly go over each area and build up the layers while trying not to be too aggressive with it. Over time, you can start to see how the color gets richer with each layer. And don't forget to spray where the pillar is sinking into the center of the portal too. This particular paint takes a while to dry, and we definitely do not want to be messing with this, so I let it dry overnight before going on to the next steps. After demonstrating your monk-like patience and it's fully dry, we're going to spray on some matte varnish. See, even when dry, this ghost tint paint dries super glossy, and I don't want to have my model look like it was handled with sticky kid fingers. Although matte varnish tends to kill the vibrancy of this color, I believe it's necessary to have a nice, flat look. And once that's done, we'll let it dry overnight again. Then we're gonna go back in with some magenta and a good amount of white by putting some of it on our wet palette. Whoops, that's never happened to me before, I swear. We're gonna mix them in together to make a light pink color. I then make another batch that has more white added to it to get 2 tones for this next step. We're going to paint the edges of the rubble that meets up with the face of the base's base face. This helps sell the glowy sexy bits of the portal. I try to make a thick line, even getting into the crevices, to help create a stronger transition to the glowing edge of the portal that meets the cork. Once the first line is dry, I go over it again and get a strong layer. Then, I'll use the second color we mixed to make a thinner line on top of that, further strengthening the transition. I'm gonna go in with some Vallejo model color black and carefully paint the pool of the portal, being extremely careful not to screw up. For this particular step, I actually push the paint toward the cork to help get into those hard to reach spots. This step is where you're going to start seeing the trick come together, as the black being right next to the hot pink creates some really cool contrast, and you can start to see the idea come to life. I also make sure to paint the inside of the base's rim, which is a small step, but adds a ton of dimension. Make sure to be careful when performing this step, as any black you accidentally get over the previous steps becomes difficult to fix. Like here, where I accidentally get black onto the pillar. Don't worry if this happens, just do like I did and completely ignore the fact that this happened and move on with your life knowing that no one will ever know your deepest, darkest shame. Now onto the galaxy painting. So years ago I saw a video done by my YouTube sensei Next Level Painting where he paints a galaxy pattern inside a banner, and I've always wanted to do that, so I kept it at the bottom of my brain jar for the right time, which is now I guess. Funny how time works. I pretty much follow it mostly step for step because I'm extremely unoriginal. I put a link to the video in the description, be sure to give it a watch because his stuff is amazing. So to start, I get some white ink and start to spray some areas where I want the nebula glows to help with the upcoming colors. I try to keep the burst small because it'll really work well when the colors go over the white fading to black. Try to keep a rough perimeter of black where the portal meets up. I found with previous experience that this does wonders when creating depth and can easily get lost if you get too close. Now, fun story for those who think airbrushing's easy, when I swapped to this airbrush I lost an O-ring in my moisture trap, causing an air leak. After looking around for a spare for what seemed like ages, I decided to crank my PSI to 1,000,000 and just sandblast my way through. Sometimes using an airbrush feels like you're a part-time wannabe artist and part-time paintball marker mechanic, causing fun moments like this. Nah. But don't worry, any huge mistakes we make can easily be covered up by repainting your black and starting all over again. While spraying these little bursts of white, you may notice my hands look like it's shaking from fear. That's partly true. But really what I'm doing is tiny little circles, which prevents you from blasting paint in a small area too much. Just another trick I've learned while using this tool. Now don't fret if you don't have an airbrush. The principle of this painting can also be done with other techniques like stippling and glazing. It'll just garner a different finish style, but the ideas behind it will be the same. Now we're going to take some Malifaux Game Air Electric Blue and start spraying a few bursts over and around some of the previously painted white spots, and every once in a while I'll spray over the black to create some variance and depth. In my particular case, I wanted a good portion of this space stuff to be blue to contrast with the edge of the portal, but I also make sure to leave room for other colors while keeping this in mind. Then we're going to get some Malifaux Game Air Hexed Lichen, basically a dark purple, and start shaping the existing color with it. The goal here is to add some layers and deepen the shading, which also helps get rid of the look of a bunch of spots with similar circle shapes, while also blending to the black. For our lightest color, we're using Malifaux Game Air Squid Pink, which we'll use to claim the last bursts of white and build up on top of all of those previous colors. I found that it goes really well over the purple as they're kind of in the same range of color. This is also a good step to reclaim some shapes that may have gotten lost while applying the other colors. Now, to end it all, we're going to select a few spots that we want to push forward and hit it with some very careful bursts of white ink. We want to still show some of the colors underneath, and having a thin ink helps with this transparency, but overall this helps set up our final steps and adds a ton of depth. You may also see an airbrush technique I use where I'll spray a quick burst on the rim of the base to get an idea of how I'm aiming, then I'll move the base so that I can keep my airbrush in the same position and center where I want to spray right in the perfect spot. Although we could be done spraying, I found that this ended up more pink than I wanted, so I decided to spray more purple to darken it as well as shape the perimeter near the portal's edge. Here's where you see my regret. I then went over some spots with the blue, and ultimately I felt this was much better. Because we have pink around the portal rim, I really wanted to emphasize the other colors. Oh, and when I was putting away my airbrush, I found the O-ring on the floor. Great timing. Now we're ready for the final steps with some brushwork. First, I repair a spot or two that got a bit of blue overspray by painting that pink mix we made earlier. Be extremely careful here, and if you feel like you don't want to do it, then don't. It's not a huge deal, and you should never give in to peer pressure. And to finish this off, we place some teeny tiny itty bitty whittle dots of white to give the impression that there be stars there. Extra points for you if you make a constellation that no one will recognize or care about, you overachieving nerd. I made this constellation up. I call it Zeus's Drawers. I make little circles of varying size in a few key spots, starting with those bursts we added white to, then just start picking out other places. For the bigger stars, we'll make a thin cross, or an X if you're nasty, to give them a little gleam. A little goes a long way here, but Feel free to give this painting some chicken pox if that's what does it for you. To clean everything up, we're going to carefully paint the rim of the base a solid black. Avoid getting it on the cork, and pay extra attention to the parts where the galaxy painting is. I purposely painted the galaxy on the inside of the rim, so making a clean line where this meets up helps with giving that illusion of depth. All we've got to do now is glue the Space Kitty on top of the base. Placement of your model is important because you can either have a badass portal cat or one that's using the litter box. I fight my trolling demons and decide to place these bad boys appropriately on their awesome bases. Don't forget to pet the kitty. And with that, we've done it! I hope this gives you some ideas. Make sure to shamelessly steal as much as you want, just like I did. If you like this video, please give a like and subscribe, and keep slinging paint, my friends, because the world could use more of your color.